For those of you that bought the brass model and you want the parts to remain the sparkly type brass, you've got to lacquer it. And the lacquer provides a barrier between the surface of the metal and oxygen, and it stops the surface oxidising. But there's one thing that you've got to remember, and it's vitally important to achieve a good finish when you're doing the lacquering, and that is you've got to thoroughly clean the surface directly after you've lacquered it, after you've polished it. You've got to get every bit of polish off the surface, and you've got to get every bit of acid off your fingers off the metal. Otherwise, if you leave a bit of your acid off your fingers on the surface of the metal, put the lacquer on, it will still darken underneath the lacquer. And the way to do that, I've found, is surgical spirits. That totally strips everything off and leaves nothing on. But I can't stress enough, it is important to spend as much time as you can to get every bit of the polish out, and particularly the acid off your hands. When we actually do the lacquering, it's done in the flat component stage, not the final model stage. You just would never get into every nook and cranny on the plane. Even using the spray tin method, any bit that was missed would still go dark. But the good thing about doing it in this method, in the flat component stage, by whatever method, the spray or the dipping method or painting on, if you make a mess of it, just get some thinners, take the lacquer off, clean it back up again, clean it off with surgical spirits, and go again. Okay, assuming that the part's fully cleaned and got the surgical spirits totally clean, one method that we can use on it is spray lacquering. Not my favourite method because I think it's the hardest to control. You've got to do a lot of practicing to get the distance right to control how much lacquer is going on. But there is a lot of people that prefer this method. One thing you've got to do when you prepare your work area, when you've got your components, you need to raise them up off the ground before you spray them, because what you don't want to do is stick them to the table or the bit of card that you've got. I say it's not my favourite method, but some people swear by it. What a lot of people have done, that I found, is they've gone for the painting method or the dipping method and used the spray as a very final light dusting over the model just to key all the joints together. But it still needs to be identified as a method that some people like. Do the sprayed components. If you use one of the stringers that's supplied, just put a little hook on the end of it and either glue it or wedge it in the top notch. Once it's polished and cleaned up, just spray about 6 to 7 inches away, rotating round till every part of the component's covered underneath, and then just hang it up to dry. Just use the one stringer, and as the lacquer builds up on this one stringer, a bit of thinners, strip it off, and then you can reuse that stringer elsewhere in the build. The next method is the painting method. Again, using either a cotton bud or a paintbrush. I found the cotton bud works quite well. The lacquer itself needs to be the liquid type, fairly not too thick. And what you do, you get quite a lot of lacquer onto the surface in drops, and you drag it to the edge of the component, and the surface tension just stops it going over the edge, and you work slowly right the way along the component. You would think this would leave it a wrinkly edge, but it doesn't. When it evaporates, you'll not know that there's a lacquered surface on there. And just work your way right along to the edge of the component. Don't worry about putting too much on, but just might take a bit of practice, But what you can do is use some of the scrap brass that you've got just to perfect your technique and pulling it to the edge. And that looks a lot on there, but it'll all disappear. And so you can use, what I found, if you try to put too thin a coat on, it starts to dry too quickly and it goes streaky as you try and pull it to the edge. When that'll dry, it'll work from the edges and dry in, and it'll totally disappear. Once you've lacquered both sides in the same way and you've let it dry, you then mount it to the wing that you've lacquered previously and glue it into its appropriate notch. That then becomes a jig in which you can then lacquer all the edges. Do all the tops first, let them dry, then turn it over, and all the bottoms are nicely presented so you can lacquer the bottom. The same idea with the fuselage. You can do all the flat components on the fuselage, mount it to the main stem and the tail and top section, glue it together, and then lacquer the edges. Okay, I'm now going to look at the dipping process, which is my preferred method of doing the lacquering. Now this is how the lacquer comes in normally in a sort of small jar, which is not really suitable for doing the dipping process. Obviously, because of the shape of the components, you need a little bit of a larger container. What I found is quite useful. Maybe take 2 or 3 of these jars to fill that. This jar has been made from half a video case, which works quite well. And again, I just hold it in the vise and fill it up. But what you'll find when you're doing the likes of this, or if you've got like a bigger jar like I've got here, for some of the components you won't be able to dip them all at once. You'll have to do it in 2 stages. For the likes of this tail, which is not ready, hasn't been polished yet for the lacquer, but just to show you the principle. For the likes of this, what you would do, you'd fill your container up, you would dip it up to the halfway mark, and then again withdraw it very slowly, and then you just hang it up on a pin to dry. When it's dried, there will be a few drips still coming down, just put a bit of cloth underneath just to catch those drips. When it's dried, just reverse the process. Also, another one on the same ilk is the likes of the tail. Now the technique for this, if you try and lacquer it up to a notch, and when the final component comes on, you won't actually see the join. If it doesn't quite fit into your box, just get a small brush and just lift it up, rotating it up, and just dip it in and raise it up to that level. And then for this one, it's an awkward component to hang, just place it on and another pin that side. You might have to play about with your hanging arrangement before you dip, so you've just done a little bit of planning. Okay, I'll not use this one just now. Some of the other ideas of previous builders, this one's been sent in by Mr. Heppel, and it's a crocodile clip with the spring reversed and the ends flatted round and the hook just bent over, and it works very well. It just holds into the notch and it works for all of the components actually. If you haven't got that type, there's another method that you can use. Just a bit of the stringer wire cut off and just a tiny little bit of super. If it doesn't hold in tight as it is, just a tiny little bit of super glue just to hold it in position. And I'll show you the technique for dipping. Again, see that component won't quite go over, so you get your brush and just sort of spoon it all the way over the top, so every bit is covered. And now take it up to your pin and you'll see there is still a few drips off. You can't get it totally, but when it dries, it will dry nice and clear. The wings are an awkward one, but it's the same sort of process. You're virtually sort of spooning it over, and I would recommend that you do it in 2 halves. If you work it up to that notch there, when the wing stiffener goes on, it'll actually cover over the join. So you put it on and you spoon over all of the lacquer on both sides and the edges all the way around. Then you just place it up to dry on some pins again. When you're doing obviously the other way as well, like that, and then just place it up to on the pin.